Save our wildlife. Save the environment. Save our world. It all starts with a little knowledge. Welcome to Our Wild World with Ellie Weiss. There is so much that's being done and can be done with help from specialists and marginalized community groups to you. We'll discuss the future of Africa, the wildlife, and the people, and show you how it affects the entire planet. Now, here is Ellie Weiss from the Wild Eyes Foundation.
Good morning, and welcome to Our Wild World. We've been discussing here just how the world has changed through a variety of perspectives and generations from around the world. My guest today, Will Knocker, is third-generation Kenyan, born on a farm in pre-independence Kenya, and brought up with an awareness and an appreciation of his natural surroundings, as his grandfather was the famous English falconer and naturalist, Captain C.W.R. Knight, and through often going on safari with his intrepid mother. I can't wait to hear more about this. As a young man at school in England, and then the Army and matriculation at London University, SOAS, he returned home to Kenya in 1984. Will has worked throughout the Horn of Africa from southern Sudan, Ethiopia, and Somalia, but most of all in his beloved Kenya. The majority of Will's work is in the development field, from tourism and wildlife, and living and working from the Masai Mara to the Tana Delta, and for the past 14 years, he has lived next to and worked in Nairobi National Park. Today, he observes with concern Kenya's collective effort to preserve this most beautiful and naturally diverse country. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to my guest today, Will Knocker. Welcome, Will. It's a pleasure having you here.
Thanks so much, Ellie. It's really nice to be on your program, and good morning to all your listeners, although it's the evening here in Nairobi. Hi, everyone.
Well, welcome, and as our guests on Our Wild World know, I bring in people from around the world, so sometimes it's a challenge to deal with the time zone. So here it's a bright, crisp early morning, and over there you're heading into what is a dry, warm evening. As we were chatting just before we started, you were talking a little bit about heading into drought, so I'd like to get into that a little bit more. But first, how about give us a little bit of your history? I gave a brief introduction, so flesh that out for us a little bit.
Yes, Ellie. Well, I've been here, as you said, since 1984, all of my life, really, in the Horn of Africa. So I'm pretty well traveled around this neck of the woods. South Sudan, I know very well, and Northern Sudan. Altogether, it used to be the biggest country in Africa. It was really, really interesting living there. And of course, because of war, one can't go there anymore. So I was very lucky to spend the time there when I did. Also in Ethiopia, I lived there for a year and have done a lot of work there over time. But most of my time has been here in Kenya. I was brought up here on a farm, and I'm now still living in Nairobi. I was at school in Nairobi. I wouldn't have thought at primary school that I'd still be here all this time later.
Well, we were talking the other day, so you live right next to Nairobi National Park?
I do, Ellie. You must come out next time you come to Nairobi. I live in something called the Silole Sanctuary. It's a little small 400 acres. It's between two river gorges, the Kiserian River, which comes down from the Ngong Hills into the Embakasi River, which is the boundary, the southern boundary of Nairobi National Park. And we're between those two rivers, so it's very rocky here, lava, and it's about 400 acres. We're right on the edge of the park, and so this boundary of the park is not fenced. So we get all the wildlife that you get in the park, which is amazing, considering it's a pretty small area right in the middle of this enormous city that is modern Nairobi, which has about 5 million people in it. So it's really a remarkable place to live, and I get into the park a lot, but yes, as I'm talking to you now, I can look out of the window and I might see a giraffe or something as I'm speaking to you.
Well, I'm envious. I'm so envious. Let's back up a little and talk some about Nairobi National Park. It's one of the oldest parks in Kenya, and as you just said, it is smack dab in the middle of a very urbanized city. I'm picturing kind of Central Park in New York with carnivorous beasties out there. And you and I had met many years ago. I remember our breakfast discussion with you, and I think it was William Deed and Mike Norton Griffiths, and talking about the fence around Nairobi National Park. So for it is as far as I recall, the park had not been fenced, and there was a huge discussion going on. So when did it get fenced? And tell us why it's fenced.
Yeah, a bit of background on the park, which is really is a fantastic place because it in the park you can see all the issues that affect us all over the world, really. Urbanization, loss of habitat, all of that sort of thing. You can all see it close up in Nairobi National Park. You're quite right in saying that it's an old national park. It was founded in 1946 and it is 120 square kilometers with about 30, nearly 40,000 acres, which I'm sure is pretty small, especially in American terms. But there we are. It is there. We still have amazing populations of most of the wildlife that exists in the wider ecosystem, which is called the Arthi Kapiti ecosystem. And one must remember that this was the ecosystem which made Kenya in many ways, because the first Europeans and white people to come here at the turn of the 20th century, people like Theodore Roosevelt, they came on the newly built railway. And the railway, of course, in the city of Nairobi started off as a watering point for the Uganda Railway way back about 100 years ago. And that's how the city of Nairobi started. It was a place to get water for the railway. And amazingly, some of this wildlife is still the wildlife that one could see then, and which attracted a lot of people to Kenya, a lot of them to hunt the animals, unfortunately, like good old Theodore Roosevelt. The animals most of the species can still be found within the national park, which is absolutely amazing. Meanwhile, the ecosystem outside, where the wildlife used to be able to migrate in and out of Nairobi National Park, which is the northern extension of the ecosystem, Arthi Kapiti ecosystem, that is being fenced off and developed and being humanized. I mean, this is the process that America went through in the middle of the 19th century when the Great Plains were fenced off and developed. So it's interesting to see it in the flesh here. So that's how it is. The park was never actually fenced, Ellie. What is happening is that it is still open, but the wildlife has nowhere to go to, as I'm suggesting. Instead, people like me, but I'm not such an offender because I don't have a fence around my place, but people along the edge of the park are fencing off their properties, and there are all sorts of development going on along the edge of the park.
So let me clarify something for our listeners. Here we
Yes.
have a bustling modern city, Nairobi, in the middle, this acreage of wildland that is somewhat pristine, but I'm not going to say untouched by man. And we have a wide variety of species there. So the core concern in the fencing, some are fenced, some are not, is a subject we talk about a lot on Our Wild World, which is human-wildlife conflict. So the conflict, of course, usually comes from carnivores eating livestock. As I understand, around that area in Nairobi is a lot of Maasai land, and that's pastoralism and cattle. So there was the big debate about fencing the park or not to create this corridor that you spoke of. Can you tell us a little bit about the importance of Nairobi National Park as a seasonal dispersal area and the critical need for these corridors and where the animals are dispersing to and from?
Yes, I can, but unfortunately, Ellie, we have to, like so much when we're discussing nature, we have to talk in the